The sun hadn't yet broken over Rome's 7 hills when the exhausted witnesses emerged from their shadowed posts. February 3rd, 152. Dornaire carried the scratch of quills against parchment, documenting what no holy scripture ever intended to record. Inside the bedchamber, Lucrezia Borgia, just 22 years old, lay beside Alfonso d'Este as the final notes were written 3 times. The witnesses had counted 3 complete consummations since sunset, each one carefully observed, meticulously documented, legally verified. But this wasn't Borgia, this was politics at its most calculated. Those 3 witnessed acts had just rewritten the map of Renaissance Italy. The heavy breathing from behind silk curtains wasn't passion. It was the sound of dynasties being forged. The whispered confirmations between bride and groom weren't endearments. They were treaties signed in flesh instead of ink, and those witnesses, they weren't perverts. They were the architects of a new world where bedroom performance determined battlefield victories. But how did wedding beds transform into political theaters, where virgin brides became seasoned diplomats and private intimacy became public spectacle? How did the Catholic Church bless rituals that turned sacred sacraments into carnal contracts? To understand this sexual diplomacy, we must rewind to 6 weeks earlier to the moment when Lucrezia Borgia discovered her value not in virtue or beauty, but in the currency of calculated consummation that would cost 100 gold ducats in her own blood. Listen, hear that sound, that's 100 gold duke, at tumbling onto counting tables in the Vatican, December 30th, 15,001. Each coin rings like a funeral bell for innocence. In the papal chambers, Lucrezia Borgia stands perfectly still as her father, Pope Alexander VI, negotiates her value down to the last florin. She's been here before twice, actually, but this 3rd marriage negotiation carries different weight. The Ferrara delegation sits across from her father, their demands specific and non-negotiable. Here's the thing about Renaissance marriage contracts. They read more like livestock purchases than love matches. The dowie discussions stretch for hours. 100 ducats, enough gold to build cathedrals or fund wars, enough to make even the wealthy Este family of Ferrara reconsider their disgust at aligning with the notorious Boers. Lucrezia watches her father's face remain stone while bartering her body. She's learned to read the micro-expressions that flash between his papal authority and paternal calculation. The Ferrara envoys push for more beyond gold. They want lands, the territories of Cento and Pieve. They want tax exemptions that will bleed Rome's coffers for generations. They want guarantees written in Vatican seal that no Borgia treachery will poison this union. But Lucrezia notices something else in their demands, something unspoken but hovering like incense in the chamber. They want proof, not just papers or promises. They want irrefutable witness proof that this marriage will be real in every sense. She's not naive anymore. 2 marriages have taught her that her body is currency more valuable than any dowry. The first marriage ended with her husband claiming impotence rather than admit the political winds had shifted. The second ended with her husband's blood painting Vatican stones. Now this 3rd negotiation carries a different energy. The Este family doesn't just want a bride. They want a guarantee that Borgia bodies can produce Este. The crucial moment comes when Cardinal Ippolito d'Este leans forward. Alfonso's brother speaks carefully, each word weighted with implication. The consummation must be witnessed, verified beyond any shadow of doubt. The air in the chamber shifts. This isn't standard protocol. Noble marriages often included witness verification, but the cardinal's tone suggests something more extensive, something that will require not just observation, but documentation. Lucrezia keeps her expression neutral, a skill perfected through years of Vatican survival, but inside, she's calculating. If her body must be currency, she'll determine the exchange rate. If her wedding night must be performance, she'll choreograph every moment. The men negotiate around her as if she's merely cargo, but she's already planning how to transform this transaction into triumph. Pope Alexander's voice cuts through her thoughts. My daughter's virtue and vigor are beyond question. The words carry threat beneath their silk. But if the Este family requires additional assurances, we are prepared to accommodate. The temperature in the room seems to drop. Additional assurances. The phrase hangs between them like a blade. The negotiations continue deep into the night. Contracts pile upon contracts. Clauses that would make canon lawyers blush are written in ecclesiastical Latin. The dowry swells beyond the initial one. 100 euro 0 ducats. As more territories are added, more privileges granted, but everyone in that room knows the real negotiation isn't about gold or land. It's about what will happen in a bedchamber 6 weeks hence. It's about how many witnesses will stand in shadows. It's about how thoroughly the consummation must be performed. As midnight approaches, Lucrezia finally speaks. Her voice carries the authority of someone who survived 2 dead husbands and countless assassination attempts. I accept these terms, simple words that sign away any pretense of traditional wedding night privacy. The men look at her, some with surprise, others with calculation, but she meets their gazes steadily. She's no longer the teenage bride of her first marriage or the grieving widow of her second. She's a Borgia who understands that power comes from controlling the narrative of your own body. The contracts are signed. The gold is promised. The territories are transferred, but the real currency remains unexchanged. That will wait for February 2nd when Lucrezia Borgia will pay in full, and the most shocking demand wasn't written in any contract. It would only be whispered on the wedding night itself. The sound still echoed through Vatican corridors 3 years later, that strangled gasp when Alfonso of Aragon drew his final breath. August 18th, 1500. Lucrezia had been at evening prayers when the assassin struck. By the time she reached her second husband's chambers, his blood had already painted abstract patterns across marble floors. The official story claimed bandits. Rome laughed at the lie. Everyone knew Burr politics had demanded Alfonso's death, and Lucrezia's tears couldn't wash away the truth. But we need to rewind further. 1493. Lucizia's first marriage to Giovanni Schwarzer started with all the usual pageantry. 13 years old, draped in cloth of gold, she'd played the virgin bride perfectly. The wedding night had proceeded according to tradition, witnesses stationed, consummation confirmed, contract sealed. For 4 years, she'd performed the role of beautiful wife, while her husband slowly realized he'd married into a viper's nest. The dissolution of that first marriage became Rome's favorite scandal. Giovanni Schwarzer, rather than admit political defeat, declared himself impotent in public before papal tribunals. He swore that despite 4 years of marriage, he'd never successfully bedded his wife. The humiliation was calculated better to claim sexual failure than acknowledge Borgia manipulation. But here's what the gossips missed. Lucrezia had orchestrated every detail. She'd provided witnesses who would swear to her intact virginity. She'd maintained perfect composure while her husband destroyed his own reputation. She'd learned that survival meant weaponizing shame. Now remember, between these 2 marriages, Lucrezia had given birth to a mysterious child, the infants Romanis, whose parentage sparked rumors that still poison historical records. Some whispered the father was her brother, Este. Others claimed Pope Alexander himself. The truth mattered less than the perception. Lucrezia Borgia had become synonymous with sexual scandal, political murder, and family secrets too dark for confession. The second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon had promised rehabilitation. 1498. A love match, the Romantics claimed, and perhaps it was. Witnesses reported genuine affection between the teenage Duke of Biscay and the 18-year-old Lucrezia. Their wedding night proceeded without the elaborate witnessed protocols that would later define her third marriage. Just standard verification, quickly done, allowing the young couple privacy to discover each other. For 2 years, something like happiness bloomed. Alfonso gave Lucrezia a son, Rodrigo. The Borgia family seemed to soften around this unexpected joy, but political winds shift quickly in Renaissance Italy. French alliance that had made Alfonso valuable became the very thing that marked him for death. Czar Borgia needed Naples neutral, not allied through his sister's marriage bed. The assassination attempt came first on July 15, 1500. Alfonso survived the initial attack, stumbling home with dagger wounds, painting his doublet crimson. Lucrezia, transformed into fierce protector, nursing him herself, tasting every meal for poison, sleeping across his threshold. For a month she kept death at bay through sheer will. But Borgia will worked both ways. On August 18th, while she was at prayers, Czar's man Michelto entered the sick room. What happened next depends on which witness you believe, but the result was singular. Alfonso of Aragon died of fever, and Lucrezia emerged changed. The widow who returned to public life was different from the girl who'd entered those two marriages. Her eyes held new knowledge. Her smile never quite reached those eyes. She'd learned that love was luxury the Borgias couldn't afford, that husbands were temporary but family was eternal, that her body would always be battlefield where dynastic wars were fought. Rome watched her transformation with fascination and fear. Some painted her as victim, the helpless daughter traded between powerful men. Others saw black widow spinning webs that trapped and devoured husbands. The truth, as always with the Borgias, was more complex. Lucrezia had survived what would have destroyed others. She'd emerged not broken, but reforged like the steel her future husband would shape in Ferrara forges. Here's what the marriage negotiators in December 151 understood. They weren't acquiring some innocent maiden. Lucrezia Borgia brought dowry of scandal, reputation of survival, and knowledge of exactly how marriages could end. The Este family knew they were negotiating with damaged goods, but sometimes damage creates value. A woman who'd survived 2 failed marriages understood the stakes. A woman who'd been accused of every possible sin had nothing left to lose. A woman who'd watched love die in Vatican chambers would perform any wedding night ritual without flinching, but her second wedding night would end in blood. The Vatican hall still echoed with his screams. Yet someone had been watching her survive both disasters. Someone who saw opportunity where others saw damaged goods. The roar of forge fires and ringing hammer blows defined Alfonso d'Este long before wedding contracts entered his world. In Ferrara's armories, the Duke's heir worked metal with his own hands, unusual for nobility, scandalous for a future sovereign. But Alfonso found truth in the forge that escaped him in court. Iron didn't lie. Steel didn't scheme. When heated to white-hot perfection and hammered into shape, metal became what you made it. No politics, just power shaped by will and strength. Born in 1476, Alfonso grew up understanding that he was spare heir, not treasured eldest. His brother Hiro died young, thrusting Alfonso into succession he'd never wanted. The Este of Ferrara glittered with Renaissance brilliance. His sister Isabella married to Francesco Gonzaga of Mantua, his brother rising through church ranks. But Alfonso preferred the foundry to the throne room, the honest sweat of metal work to the perfumed lies of diplomacy. His obsession with artillery wasn't mere hobby. Alfonso d'Este would become Renaissance Italy's premier military engineer, designing cannons that could shatter walls previously thought impregnable. He understood force multipliers, trajectory calculations, the physics of destruction. But in December 15,001, his family demanded he apply that same practical intelligence to marriage, specifically marriage to the Pope's notorious daughter. The Este family's initial revulsion at the proposed match was spectacular. Isabella d'Este wrote letters dripping with disgust. Cardinal Ippolito schemed for alternatives. The Borgias, those Spanish upstarts who bought the papacy, whose name was synonymous with poison and perversion. The Este family traced lineage back to Charlemagne. They ruled Ferrara when Rome was still fighting over pig markets. Now they were expected to welcome Lucrezia Borgia, the thrice-married, scandal-drenched daughter of a corrupt pope. But Alfonso approached the proposal like any engineering problem. What were the forces at play? The French threatened from the north. Venice pressed from the east. The Papal States controlled the south. Ferrara needed allies, and Pope Alexander VI offered the ultimate alliance sealed with his daughter's body and sweetened with impossible dowry. 100 ducats could buy many cannons. Papal protection was worth any reputation damage. Here's what set Alfonso apart from typical Renaissance princes. He didn't pretend romance or devise elaborate schemes. He simply accepted. No poetry, no protestations, no diplomatic dancing. When his family presented the marriage contract, he studied it like artillery specifications. When they explained the unusual consummation requirements, he nodded as if they described bronze casting temperatures. This was transaction, not transformation, input and output, mechanical process with measurable results. But something in Alfonso's practical nature appealed to power brokers. A man who worked forges with common smiths wouldn't flinch at witnessed betting. A prince who understood trajectory and force would appreciate the political physics of this marriage. How joining Borgia ambition toEste's stability could create momentum neither family could achieve alone. Most importantly, a warrior who designed instruments of death understood that marriage too was warfare by other means. The letters between Rome and Ferrara through January 152 reveal Alfonso's growing involvement in negotiations, not the financial details. He left those to counselors. But the practical elements, travel arrangements that would protect his bride from assassination attempts, security protocols for the wedding ceremony, and yes, the specific requirements for the wedding night itself. His notes preserved in Este archives read like military planning documents. Positions of witnesses, timing of documentation, contingency plans if initial consummation proved insufficient. Remember, Alfonso had been married before a brief disastrous union and annulled on grounds of non-consummation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. His first wife had claimed he'd never betted her. Now his second wife would require triple proof of his vigor. But Alfonso approached this challenge like any design problem. What was required? Evidence of consummation. How was evidence created? Through witnessed performance. How many performances would guarantee success? His practical mind settled on 3. The number of completion of certainty beyond doubt. His hands that shaped bronze into weapons would soon shape flesh into dynasty. The same methodical patience that perfected cannon design would be applied to wedding night performance. Where other grooms might have felt humiliation at such public display, Alfonso saw only specifications to meet. Where others might have raged against witnessed intimacy, he calculated angles and approaches like plotting artillery trajectories. But forging weapons was nothing compared to forging this alliance. The metal he'd shape on February 2nd wouldn't be bronze or iron. It would be the molten fusion of 2 bodies, creating political alloy stronger than either alone. His hands that shaped instruments of death would soon shape a dynasty. And then came the letter proposing a meeting that would change everything. A private encounter before the public performance. The sudden intake of breath when their eyes first met changed everything. January 30th, 152, the Bentivoglio Palace in Bologna had been chosen as neutral ground for the pre-wedding meeting. Just 2 days before the official ceremony, political necessity demanded that bride and groom actually see each other before performing their public union. What happened in that torch-lit chamber would transform calculated transaction into something dangerously real. Lucrezia arrived first, dressed strategically, not the cloth of gold that screamed Borgia wealth, but deep burgundy velvet that suggested maturity, experience, survival. Her ladies had wanted jewels, but she chose restraint. Let Alfonso see the woman, not the dowry. Let him meet Lucrezia, not the legend. She positioned herself beside a window where winter light would catch the gold in her hair. Still her best feature at 22. Despite everything, Alfonso entered with his characteristic directness. No flourishing bow, no pretty speeches. He simply walked in, looked at her, and stopped. Here's what the witnesses reported. For 3 heartbeats, neither moved. Then Lucrezia smiled. Not the practiced court smile that had charmed and deceived for years, but something unpracticed, almost surprised. Alfonso took 3 steps forward and said simply, "You're not what I expected." The formal pleasantries should have followed. Scripted compliments about beauty and virtue, honor and duty. Instead, Lucrezia laughed, actually laughed, and responded, "Neither are you." The tension broke like fever. Within minutes, they were talking about subjects that would have horrified their protocol ministers. Alfonso described his canon designs. Lucrezia admitted her exhaustion with court ceremonies. He showed her his hands scarred from forge work. She told him about surviving 2 husbands without ever having a real marriage. But remember, this wasn't some romantic fairy tale. These were 2 intelligent people recognizing unexpected compatibility. Alfonso's pragmatism matched Lucrezia's survival instincts. Her political sophistication complemented his military mind. Where others saw the Pope's scandalous daughter, Alfonso saw a woman who navigated impossible situations with remarkable skill. Where others saw the brutish Este prince, Lucrezia recognized someone who valued truth over appearance. The meeting was supposed to last 1 hour. They talked for 3. Witnesses reported an energy shift in the room, not the crackling tension of lust, but something more dangerous for political marriages, genuine interest. They discussed the French threat with equal knowledge. They debated Venetian expansion with matching cynicism. When Alfonso mentioned the unusual consummation requirements, Lucrezia didn't blush or protest. She simply asked 3 times. And when he nodded, she said, "Then we'd better like each other." Here's what made this spark particularly dangerous. It was mutual and unexpected. Both had entered that chamber prepared for duty, resigned to necessity. Neither had anticipated possibility. The physical attraction was undeniable. Witnesses noted how they gradually moved closer during conversation, how their hands almost touched when examining a map of disputed territories. But the mental connection proved more intoxicating. Finally, they'd each met someone who understood the weight of dynasty, the burden of reputation, exhaustion of constant performance. Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, observing from the doorway, later wrote to Isabella about his shock. He had expected his brother to endure the meeting with characteristic stoicism. Instead, Alfonso was engaged, even animated. When discussion turned to the wedding night protocols, the cardinal braced for awkwardness, but Lucrezia addressed it with startling directness. "If we must perform, at least we'll perform together." Alfonso's response was equally pragmatic. 3 times seems excessive, but I've designed canons with more complicated specifications. Dangerous thing about unexpected compatibility is how it complicates simple transactions. What should have been mechanical duty now carried possibility of pleasure. What should have been political performance might become personal connection. Both understood the implications. If they actually desired each other, the witnessed consummation would be easier, but also harder. Easier because physical response wouldn't require pretense. Harder because genuine intimacy under observation violated something essential. As the meeting concluded, Alfonso did something uncharacteristic. He took Lucrezia's hand, not to kiss it in formal farewell, but to examine it, turning it over to see her palms soft. He said, but strong underneath like good steel. She responded by touching one of his forged scars. "We all bear marks from our work." The witnesses pretended not to notice the pause before they separated, the way their fingers lingered in contact. But genuine attraction was the one thing nobody had planned for. The elaborate contracts hadn't accounted for desire. The witness consummation protocols assumed mechanical performance, not mutual passion. This spark would make their performance both easier and infinitely more dangerous. In just 3 days, this private passion would become the most public performance in Renaissance history. Church bells rang across Ferrara for the feast of the purification of the Virgin as Lucrezia Borgia prepared to sacrifice her privacy on altar of politics, February 2nd, 152. The calculated irony of the date wasn't lost on anyone. The Virgin Mary's holiest celebration would witness the most methodically planned deflowering in Renaissance memory. Inside the cathedral, priests prepared to bless a union that would culminate in witnessed population. Sacred and profane danced together like wedding guests. The morning began with purification rituals that bordered on parody. Lucrezia bathed in holy water mixed with rose petals, while nuns sang hymns about virginal virtue. Never mind that she'd been married twice, born at least 1 child, and survived enough scandal to damn a dozen women. Today she would play virgin bride one final time, knowing that by dawn her body would have been transaction, battlefield, and peace treaty all at once. Alfonso waited at the cathedral in armor not ceremonial but functional. His choice sent a message. This was alliance forged in strength, not sentiment. When Lucrezia arrived, her dress answered his armor with its own defiance. White silk shot through with gold thread that caught light like weapon strikes. The train stretched behind her like conquered territory. Her hair, that famous golden cascade, was bound with pearls the size of musk balls. She was armed for different warfare. Here's what the wedding guests whispered about: the presence of 2 distinct groups of observers. First, the traditional witnesses, family members, church officials, diplomatic envoys. Behind them, almost hidden in cathedral shadows, stood a second group. Men with portable writing desks, physicians with medical training, legal experts versed in consummation law. Everyone knew these observers weren't here for the wedding. They were preparing for what would follow. The Mass itself became a study in contrasts. Cardinal Ippolito d'Este presided, his Latin phrases carrying double meanings for those who listened closely. Let this union be fruitful meant heirs and territorial expansion. May God bless this sacred bond included the profane bonding scheduled for midnight. When it came time for the blessing of the marriage bed, a traditional part of noble ceremonies, the cardinal's voice carried unusual emphasis. This bed would bear more blessing and burden than most, but the most blasphemous moment came during the homily. The cardinal spoke of Mary's purity of sacred vessel, chosen for divine purpose. His gaze fixed on Lucrezia as he described how flesh could serve higher calling, how women's bodies became instruments of God's will. The subtext screamed louder than any sermon. Tonight, Lucrezia's body would serve the god of political necessity, and her sacrifice would be measured in witness penetrations. The exchange of rings proceeded with military precision. Alfonso's hands, those forged-scarred instruments of creation and destruction, were steady as they slipped gold onto Lucrezia's finger. Her response was equally controlled, though witnesses noted the slight tremor as she completed the reciprocal gesture. When they kissed to seal the union, it was brief, formal, correct. The real sealing would come later, documented by those shadow observers. Here's the thing about Renaissance Catholic marriage. It wasn't considered truly valid until consummated. The Church's obsession with physical union created the very loophole that allowed for witnessed beddings. If marriage required sexual completion, then sexual completion required proof. The priests who blessed these unions knew exactly what they sanctified. The holy water that sanctified the marriage bed would be supplemented by other fluids before dawn. The wedding feast that followed was a masterpiece of tension disguised as celebration. Lucrezia and Alfonso sat at the high table, accepting congratulations that everyone knew were premature. The real congratulations would come tomorrow after the witnesses confirmed success. Every toast carried double meaning. Every jest about wedding nights landed with unusual weight. The assembled nobles ate and drank while stealing glances at the bride and groom, wondering if they were prepared for what awaited. As midnight approached, the traditional bedding ceremony began, but this was no ordinary charivari with its good-natured rivalry. The witnesses assembled with documentary precision. Lucrezia's ladies undressed her in the chamber, while observers noted her apparent health and lack of visible defects. Alfonso's men performed the same service, though he dismissed them quickly, preferring to finish preparations alone. The bed itself had been blessed 3 times, once for each planned consummation, but the real ceremony would begin after the priest departed. The sacred rites were finished, but the profane ritual was about to commence. The Virgin's feast would witness the most unveil of rituals. As the cathedral bell struck midnight, marking the feast day's end, Lucrezia entered the bedchamber where Alfonso waited. Behind them, witnesses took their positions. Ahead of them lay the most documented wedding night in history. As the wedding feast ended, everyone knew the real test was about to begin. Behind closed doors with open witnesses, the scratch of quills preparing parchment sounded like death rattles in the bedchamber's anteroom. February 2nd, just before midnight, 3 witnesses took their positions with the solemnity of executioners preparing for state-sanctioned killing. These weren't casual observers, but trained professionals. A papal notary, a physician from the University of Bologna, and most unnervingly, Bernardino de Prosperi, Cardinal Ippolito's secretary, and Isabella d'Este's personal spy in the Este court. The protocol had been established days earlier with military precision. Witnesses would position themselves in an adjacent chamber, door slightly ajar enough to hear, not necessarily see, though if visual confirmation became necessary, they were authorized to enter. Each man carried specific tools, the notary with his sealed parchments and authenticated ink, the physician with his medical texts on consummation evidence, Prosper with his perfect memory and poison pen that would report every detail to Isabella. Here's what made this witness arrangement particularly invasive. They weren't just confirming a single act. The Este contract required sufficient proof of viral completion, a phrase whose ambiguity had been deliberately cultivated. In practice, this meant multiple confirmations. The witnesses would need to document not just that consummation occurred, but that it was vigorous, repeated, and likely to produce heirs. Privacy wasn't just sacrificed. It was systematically destroyed. The furniture arrangement itself told the story. The marriage bed dominated the chamber's center, positioned so sounds would carry clearly to the witnesses. Station, candles were placed to cast shadows that would reveal motion without exposing too much detail. Fresh linens waited in neat stacks. They would be collected and examined after each act. Physical evidence to support auditory testimony. The clinical preparation transformed intimate space into medical theater, but remember, these witnesses weren't simply voyeurs. They served legal function in an age when marriage validity could be challenged for non-consummation. Noble families had seen alliances crumble when one party claimed the marriage was never completed. The Schwarzer family still smarted from Giovanni's impotence claims against Lucrezia. The Este family wouldn't risk similar humiliation. If this marriage was to anchor their alliance with Rome, it needed documentation beyond dispute. The physician, Dr. Ludovico Cari, had written extensively on signs of successful consummation. His presence added medical authority to legal documentation. He would note physical evidence, the bride's cries, the groom's exertions, the state of linens, even the odor that indicated completion. His clinical notes would transform human intimacy into biological data. Every gasp would become medical testimony, every moan a legal notation. Bernardino Drosperi served a different purpose. As Isabella D's spy, he would report not just facts but impressions. Isabella wanted to know if her brother truly desired this Borgia bride or merely performed duty. She wanted details that would confirm or deny the growing rumors of actual affection between the unlikely couple. Prosper's letters preserved in Manuan archives would provide the most intimate account of what transpired. The notary Francesco Casello carried the gravest responsibility. His sealed documents would become legal proof of the marriage's validity. One false note, one uncertain observation, and the entire alliance could crumble. He'd prepared 3 separate parchments, one for each planned consummation. The redundancy was an accident. If challenged, the Este family could produce triple documentation of their heir's virility and his bride's compliance. As midnight struck, the witnesses made final preparations. Inkwells were tested for proper flow. Candles were trimmed to burn cleanly. The door between chambers was adjusted to optimal angle, open enough for sound, closed enough for dignity. Pretense, then they heard footsteps approaching. Alfonso's heavy tread, Lucizia's lighter step. The witnesses tensed like hunters hearing prey approach. Their work was about to begin. Here's what those witnesses didn't expect. The quiet conversation that preceded action. Through the cracked door, they heard Alfonso say, "I'm sorry for this necessity." Lucizia's response was equally surprising. "We're both instruments tonight. Let's at least be instruments together." This wasn't the dialogue of political puppets, but of co-conspirators. The witnesses exchanged glances. This might be more complicated than simple documentation. The protocol required witnesses to note the exact time of each significant moment. Casello's notations began. At midnight, the parties entered the chamber. Cari added medical observations. Both appeared in good health, capable of performing marital duties. Prosper scribbled more personal details. The Duke touched his bride's face with unexpected tenderness. Already the 3 accounts were diverging legal facts, medical data, and human drama. Every gasp would become testimony. Every sound would be scratched onto parchment. The Chancellor's quill was poised to capture what should never be written, but 3 witnesses would discover that one consummation wouldn't be enough. Not for the Borgias. The heavy click of the bed-chamber door locking echoed like a prison gate closing. 12:47 a.m. According to Casello's precise notation, inside the chamber, Alfonso d'Este and Lucrezia Borgia faced each other across 3 ft of charged air, both understanding that their next actions would be scrutinized, documented, and preserved in archives for centuries. The first consummation needed to establish basic legitimacy proof that this marriage was real, physical, completed. Alfonso moved first, approaching with the same methodical precision he used in his workshops. But his hands, those steady instruments that shaped molten metal, trembled slightly as they reached for Lucrezia's shoulders. She stood perfectly still, allowing him to unlace the nightgown her ladies had so carefully arranged. Neither spoke. What words could match this moment where private bodies became public property? Through the adjoining door, the witnesses listened with professional intensity. Prosperity noted the rustle of falling fabric, the soft gasp. Whether surprise or pleasure, he couldn't determine. Dr. Carey listened for sounds of distress that might indicate physical inability. Casello simply recorded. The parties began their marital duties at 17 minutes before 1:00. Here's what the witnesses couldn't see but surely heard. The careful negotiation of two experienced people trying to find genuine connection within artificial constraints. Alfonso's voice low but audible. Tell me if Lucrezia's interruption. I will proceed. The bedrops creaked as weight shifted. A sharp intake of breath, his or hers. The witnesses debated later. Then rhythmic sounds that required no interpretation. But this wasn't the brutal claiming that wedding night horror stories often described. The witnesses noted surprising gentleness in the proceedings. No cries of pain from the bride, though she was supposedly virgin for this third marriage. Everyone knew better. No aggressive dominance from the groom. Alfonso approached his bride like he approached his canons, with respect for power that could destroy if mishandled. Instead, there were murmured words too quiet for documentation, soft laughter quickly suppressed, sounds of mutual accommodation. The physician made clinical notes about duration and vigor. By his estimation, the first coupling lasted approximately 20 minutes, respectable for establishing legitimacy. He noted the bride's vocal responses as indicating successful penetration and probable completion. The groom's breathing patterns suggested adequate exertion without exhaustion. Medical testimony reduced human intimacy to biological mechanics. Prosper's account provided more human detail. He described hearing Lucrezia whisper something that made Alfonso laugh, actually laugh during the act itself. He noted a tenderness in their movements that suggested the Bentivoglio meeting spark had ignited into something warmer. Most surprisingly, he recorded that after completion, they didn't immediately separate. Convention dictated quick withdrawal to allow witnesses confirmation, but the couple remained entwined, speaking too quietly for eavesdropping. The critical moment came when Alfonso called out, "The first seal is set." The formal phrase agreed upon beforehand signaled witnesses to note successful completion. Casello recorded the time, 1:23 a.m. Dr. Carey prepared to examine linens that would be brought shortly. Prosperity scribbled his impression that both parties sounded remarkably composed for such circumstances. Here's what truly distinguished this first act, its efficiency without brutality. Many witnessed consummations became horrible orals of performance anxiety, meetings, political pressure, men failed to perform, women wept through violation, witnesses recorded disaster, but Alfonso and Lucrezia managed something rarer. They completed their duty while maintaining dignity. Perhaps their mutual attraction helped. Perhaps their shared understanding of political necessity created partnership. Whatever the reason, the first consummation succeeded beyond basic requirements. The servants entered to change linens, carefully preserving the stained sheets that would serve as physical evidence. Dr. Carey examined them with professional detachment, noting blood stains that suggested virginity, though everyone knew Lucrezia's ladies had prepared chicken blood for this purpose. The physical proof mattered less than the performance itself. What counted was that Duke and Duchess had united. Witnesses had confirmed and documentation existed, but establishing legitimacy was only the beginning. As new sheets were arranged, as wine was brought to restore the couple's strength, the witnesses heard Alfonso say, "Once proves capacity, twice proves vigor, but your family's requirement." Lucrezia's response was lost to history, but Prosper noted she sounded determined rather than dismayed. The witnesses whispered among themselves, "Would once be enough." The contract was ambiguous. Sufficient proof could mean single consummation, but everyone knew the Borgias. Everyone understood that Pope Alexander VI hadn't paid 100,000 ducats for standard documentation. The witnesses whispered, "Would once be enough." Then came the words nobody expected. Again, the treaty requires proof beyond doubt. Exhausted breathing filled the chamber as the second hour began, 2:15 a.m. Casello noted with his relentless precision. The fresh linens already showed wrinkles from restless bodies trying to recover strength. Through the witness portal came sounds of wine being poured, whispered consultations, the rustle of bodies shifting to find energy for another performance. This second consummation would prove endurance that the first hadn't been mere lucky accident. Lucrezia's voice carried clearly. The witnesses expect theatrical moaning. "Should I oblige?" Alfonso's response surprised everyone listening. "Be yourself." They're documenting truth tonight, not theater. But truth and theater had already blended beyond separation. Every genuine gasp would be recorded as evidence. Every real pleasure would become political testimony. The second act would blur lines between authentic desire and necessary performance. Dr. Carey made notes about recovery time. Medically speaking, the 30-minute interval suggested youthful vigor and probable genuine attraction. His clinical observations missed the human drama. How do people, exhausted by ceremony and surveillance, found reserves of strength in shared purpose? The witnesses heard low laughter again. Whatever private jokes sustained them through this ordeal remained unrecorded. Here's what made the second consummation more challenging. Fatigue competed with expectation. The first act had established basic success. The second needed to prove that success could be repeated, that the Este line wouldn't die for lack of air-making vigor. Alfonso approached this challenge like any engineering problem. Angle, leverage, rhythm, all calculated for maximum efficiency with minimum exhaustion. But calculation couldn't fully suppress the growing intimacy between them. The sounds that reached the witnesses suggested less mechanical precision this time. Prosper noted increased vocalization from both parties. Whether this was growing comfort with their situation or genuine passion building, despite surveillance, he couldn't determine. His letter to Isabella would later speculate that your brother seems to have found unexpected pleasure in his duty, but exhaustion crept into the performance. The witnesses heard Alfonso's breathing grow labored. Once proceedings paused entirely, long enough for Casello to wonder if they should intervene, then Lucrezia's voice, soft but carrying, "We're halfway to freedom." The encouragement worked. Movement resumed with renewed determination. The bride was coaching her groom through their shared ordeal. Partnership forged in the strangest circumstances. The physical demand showed in other ways. The witnesses heard fumbling with oil lamps as positions were adjusted for comfort over speed. There was a crash later revealed to be a knocked-over water pitcher, followed by muffled cursing and suppressed giggles. Even in this most formal of performances, human clumsiness intruded. The witnesses pretended not to hear, though Prosper definitely recorded it for Isabella's amusement. Time stretched strangely in that chamber. Minutes felt like hours for the exhausted couple. For the witnesses, maintaining professional attention through repetitive sounds proved its own challenge. Casello's notations grew terser. Carey dozed briefly, jerking awake when particularly loud exclamations pierced the air. Only Prosperity remained fully alert, his spy's instincts engaged by every nuance. Here's what the second consummation revealed. Transformation of duty into something resembling partnership. The witnesses heard whispered encouragements, gentle corrections, mutual adjustments. This wasn't conqueror and conquered, but two people working together toward shared goal. When completion finally came at 3:42 a.m., according to Casello, it was announced not with Alfonso's formal declaration, but with Lucrezia's exhausted laugh and words. "The second seal is set, my lords." The linen change this time took longer. Servants found the couple collapsed against each other, unwilling or unable to separate immediately. Dr. Carey noted signs of significant exertion and recommended wine mixed with strengthening herbs. The sheets showed evidence of vigorous completion, though less blood. The chicken blood trick only worked once. Physical evidence was accumulating alongside written testimony, but even 2 times wouldn't satisfy the contract. As the witnesses compared notes, debating whether twice was sufficient, they heard Alfonso's voice rough with exhaustion. The Borgia Protocol demands 3. Lucrezia's response was too quiet to hear, but Prosper noted she touched her husband's face with something like tenderness. They both understood what mountain still needed climbing. The witnesses prepared for the final act. Casello readied his third parchment. Carey mixed stimulating herbs into the wine being sent to the couple. Prosper sharpened his quill for what promised to be the most dramatic documentation. The Chancellor's notes grew more clinical as the acts grew more human. As the second act concluded, a whisper from the shadows. The Borgia Protocol demands 3. Preed, on silence filled Ferrara as the third trial approached. 4:30 a.m. Even the witnesses struggled against exhaustion. But protocol demanded completion. In the bedchamber, 2 bodies that had been political instruments all night faced their final performance. The room smelled of sweat and wine, spent passion and growing desperation. 3 times, the number that would echo through European bedchambers as the gold standard of virility proof. Alfonso's voice with exhaustion. "I'm not sure I can." Lucrezia's response carried steel beneath silk. "You can. We've come too far to fail now. Through the witness portal, Prosper noted this reversal. The bride had become the strength, encouraging her flagging groom toward their mutual goal. The woman who'd survived 2 dead husbands wouldn't let a third fail her through mere exhaustion. Dr. Carey worried about medical implications. 3 consummations in 5 hours pushed human endurance, especially for a man who'd already endured a full day of ceremony. His note mentioned risk of injury through excessive exertion and possible harmful effects on future fertility, but medicine bowed to politics. The contract demanded 3. The Borgias expected 3. It would be regardless of human cost. Here's what the witnesses heard in that final approach. Determination replacing passion or substituting for desire. The sounds were different now. Less rhythmic confidence, more desperate effort. Lucrezia's encouragements came constantly. Almost there. Stay with me for our future. Alfonso's responses were wordless, just breathing that suggested supreme effort against failing flesh. The mechanical nature of this third act stripped away any remaining pretense. This was purely political now. 2 exhausted people pushing bodies past reasonable limits for dynastic necessity. Yet within that mechanical desperation, something profound emerged. Witnesses heard them working as perfect partners, adjusting constantly, supporting each other through sheer determination to succeed. Casello's notes for the third consummation were sparse. Even he seemed affected by the human drama unfolding. His usual precise timestamps gave way to simpler annotations. Third attempt begun near dawn. Considerable effort evident. Both parties persevering despite obvious exhaustion. Legal language failed to capture what was happening in that chamber. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was the approaching dawn. Perhaps the knowledge that this was the final trial. Perhaps just the delirium of exhaustion. The witnesses heard laughter, not bitter or hysterical, but genuinely amused. Lucrezia said something about earning every duke of that dowry. Alfonso responded with a comment about cannons requiring less careful aim. They were joking through their ordeal, finding absurdity in their situation. This gallows humor seemed to provide new energy. The witnesses noted renewed vigor, though how much was genuine and how much was final. Desperate performance. None could say. Prosperity wrote that they seemed to find strength in shared adversity. Carey worried about physical damage, but noted no sounds of actual distress. Casello simply documented, final consummation proceeding. Dawn light crept through windows as the third act reached crescendo. 5:47 a.m. Casello noted the precise moment when Alfonso's voice, barely audible, announced, "The third seal is set." But it was Lucrezia who added, loud enough for all witnesses to hear, "The Borgia promise is fulfilled. Let no one doubt Este vigor or Borgia determination." The silence that followed was profound. No movement from the bedchamber, no sound from the witnesses. Everyone involved seemed stunned by what they'd endured and accomplished. Then, breaking the spell, the sound of slow applause. Prosperity, overcome by the moment, was clapping. The other witnesses joined him. It was bizarre, inappropriate, and entirely human recognition of superhuman effort in service of inhuman demands, but the documentation wasn't complete. Servants entered to find the couple so entwined they couldn't initially separate them for linen collection. When they finally managed to change the sheets, Dr. Carey noted, evidence of completion despite extreme exhaustion. The final physical proof was less dramatic than the first bodies pushed to limb. Its leave different traces, but combined with witness testimony, it was enough. 3 times, the number that would echo through European bedchambers for generations. 3 times to prove virility, fertility, and political commitment. 3 times to transform Lucrezia from Borgia scandal to Este duchess. 3 times to seal an alliance that would reshape Italy. Dawn was breaking, but the performance wasn't over. As the sun rose on February 3rd, the witnesses emerged with documentation that would reshape Italy. But Lucrezia would pay for this triumph with her own blood. The wet gasp of a stillborn silence shattered Ferrara's celebration 7 months later. September 5th, 152. Lucrezia Borgia, who'd survived 3 husbands and countless poisoning attempts, nearly died bringing forth the child conceived during that triple consummation. The baby girl lived just long enough to be baptized before surrendering to whatever curse haunted Borgia wombs. As Lucrezia hemorrhaged in childbed, The physicians whispered that her body was claiming payment for February's performance, but survival was the Borgia specialty. For 2 weeks, Lucrezia balanced between this world and the next. Fever dreams mixed with memories, Alfonso's exhausted face at dawn, witnesses applauding superhuman effort, her father's letters congratulating successful alliance. When she finally opened clear eyes on September 20th, her first words were, "Did the documentation arrive in Rome?" Even near death, she remained politician first, woman second. The physical toll was devastating. Lucrezia would suffer 4 more miscarriages over the following years, her body never fully recovering from that first brutal pregnancy. Dr. Carey, who'd witnessed the wedding night, privately noted that excessive consummation may have damaged the Duchess's reproductive capacity. But such medical niceties mattered little against political reality. The triple consummation had served its purpose. The marriage was unassailable. Here's what happened. While Lucrezia recovered, the Borgia Protocol spread across Europe like fashion or plague. Within months, other noble families were demanding witness triple consummations for their own alliances. The French court adopted modified versions. German princes incorporated the practice into marriage contracts. What had been extraordinary became expectation, all because one night in Ferrara had proven that bodies could be pushed to superhuman limits for political gain. But Lucrezia had survived worse than childbed fever, and she emerged with new knowledge. Her body might be damaged, but her mind had sharpened during those weeks of delirium. She understood now that if sexuality was currency, she needed to control the mint. The docile performance of wedding night duty was over. Time to deploy her intimate knowledge as weapon. The Francesco Gonzaga affair began in 153, precisely calculated for maximum damage. Gonzaga was married to Isabella d'Este, Alfonso's sister, Lucrezia's harshest critic and employer of Bernardino de Prosper, the spy who documented every wedding night gasp. The seduction was surgical in its precision. Lucrezia knew Isabella's weakness was her certainty of superiority. What better revenge than stealing her husband's desire? The affair itself was less important than its strategic deployment. Lucrezia ensured evidence reached Isabella at carefully chosen moments. A love letter discovered during state negotiations, a gift recognized during family gatherings. Each revelation was calculated to destabilize Este family dynamics exactly when Lucrezia needed leverage. The woman who'd been documented like livestock now controlled the documentation herself. Remember, this wasn't mere adultery. This was weaponized sexuality deployed with military precision. Lucrezia had learned from that wedding night that witnesses and documentation were double-edged swords. Yes, they could prove legitimacy, but they also created precedent for surveillance. She made sure her affair with Gonzaga generated its own documentation, its own witnesses, its own archive of scandal she could deploy when needed. Alfonso's reaction revealed the pragmatism that had carried them through their wedding night. He didn't rage or threaten. He simply noted that his wife had learned to play the game at master level. Their marriage evolved into something stranger and more durable than love. A partnership between equals who understood that bodies were battlefields and bedrooms were theaters of war. They would have 7 children together, though several died young. Each pregnancy a reminder of that first brutal night's cost, but survival meant deploying her sexuality as a weapon once more. The Borgia name still carried poison, but Lucrezia had transformed it into antidote. She became the most effective Este duchess in generations, using her scandalous reputation as armor and weapon combined. When enemies whispered about her past, she reminded them she'd survived things that would destroy them. When allies wavered, she deployed carefully calibrated intimacies to secure loyalty. Isabella d'Este would learn that wedding night witnesses could become cuckolds. The woman who'd ordered documentation of Lucrezia's humiliation now lived with documentation of her own husband's infidelity. The spy Prosper found his loyalty divided between reporting truth and protecting his patroness from painful revelations. The witnesses who'd thought they were documenting Borgia submission had actually recorded Este vulnerability. And locked away in Vatican vaults, the documentation of that night would sleep for 500 years, hiding truths too explosive for history. The triple consummation records, the witness testimonies, the medical examinations, all buried in archives that wouldn't open until democracy replaced dynasty and scandal became scholarship. Now we return to where we began, dawn breaking over Ferrara on February 3rd, 152. But now you understand what those exhausted witnesses had really documented. Not just 3 consummations, but the birth of a new kind of political power. As they emerged from their shadowed posts, Castello, Carey, and Prosperity carried more than parchments. They carried proof that human bodies could endure inhuman demands, that marriage beds could become negotiation tables, that witnessed intimacy could forge stronger alliances than any treaty. In the bedchamber, Lucrezia and Alfonso lay in exhausted triumph. The sheets around them told the story. Blood stains from fabricated virginity, wine stains from desperate restoration, sweat stains from superhuman effort. Servants crept in to collect these relics, each stained fabric becoming historical artifact. The physical evidence would be preserved alongside written testimony. Triple redundancy for triple consummation. Castello's final notation read, at dawn on the 3rd day of February, in the year of our Lord 152, the marriage of Duke Alfonso d'Este and Duchess Lucrezia Borgia was consummated 3 times in the presence of witnesses, each act documented and verified according to contractual requirements. Dry legal language that missed everything important. The laughter through exhaustion, the partnership through performance, the humanity persisting despite inhuman demands. Dr. Carr's medical report focused on physical evidence of completion, but noted both parties demonstrated remarkable endurance, suggesting unusual compatibility despite political nature of union. Even medical language couldn't quite capture what he'd witnessed. 2 people transforming political necessity into personal triumph through sheer force of will. But it was Prosper's report to Isabella d'Este that captured the real transformation. His letter preserved in Manuan archives described not the humiliation of the Borgia bride, but her elevation to Este equal. Your brother has met his match in wit and will. What was meant to subordinate has instead created partnership. The Borgia woman proved that endurance can be its own form of power, as the witnesses departed to file their reports, as servants stripped the bed of its evidence, as Lucrezia and Alfonso finally slept in private peace. The template was set. Across Europe, marriage contracts would soon include consummation clauses inspired by this night. Witness protocols would become standardized. The marriage bed had been transformed from private sanctuary to public stage, and the transformation would last centuries. The Borgia Protocol spread across Renaissance Europe like a new plague of propriety. Within a decade, triple consummation became gold standard for political marriages. Royal courts from Paris to Prague adopted witness requirements. Noble families invested in special chambers designed for optimal acoustic documentation. What Lucrezia and Alfonso endured through necessity became expectation for generations. The original documents, those careful notations by Castello, Carey, and Prosperi, vanished into Vatican archives where they slept for 500 years, too scandalous for contemporary chroniclers, too dangerous for family histories. They waited until our modern age could stomach their revelations. When finally unearthed, in the 1990s, they revealed not the debauchery that legend suggested, but something more disturbing, the systematic transformation of intimacy into bureaucracy. Lucrezia Borgia lived until 1519, bearing Alfonso 7 children despite her damaged body, ruling Ferrara with intelligence that transformed the Dutch, deploying her sexuality as diplomatic weapon when needed. She'd learned that night in 152 that if bodies must be battlefields, she would choose the terms of engagement. Her calculated affairs, strategic pregnancies, and careful documentation created a new template for female power in patriarchal world. The witnesses to that triple consummation thought they were documenting hostility and boo submission. Instead, they recorded the birth of sexual politics as formal discipline. Every witness bedding that followed, every documented consummation across Europe, traced back that February dawn in Ferrara when 3 completions proved that flesh could be contract and performance could be power. Today we're horrified by such invasion of privacy, such reduction of intimacy to political theater. But in our age of leaked videos and documented scandals, of performances for invisible audiences and privacy sacrificed for power, perhaps we're not so different. Bodies remain battlefields, bedrooms remain political, and somewhere in Vatican vaults those careful notations wait, reminding us that power has always demanded its particular consummations. Este.